Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Constitution of American Life with the 4 Bs. We are excited to have you with us today. This is our 3rd episode of Season 2, we like to call it, with our discussion about the American Constitution and American politics. Last week, I explained to you why we're called the 4 Bs, but I thought this week, rather just look at names on the screen, that we give you a little background to each of us. And I have no idea what you're seeing on your screen, but to my top left is the youngest of the group, also a former star quarterback from Bakersfield, California. He is Dr. Professor Mike Williams from the University of San Diego. He works in the political science department, is a comparativist, I think, with a focus on South Africa. And he was for many years a presenter for the We the People Assist in the Constitution program at our Summer Institute's professional development program, and one of the most popular ones there. And also he's got a 12-year-old who will be in the Major League Baseball pitching for the Los Angeles Dodgers in about I think 7-8 years there. So he's pretty excited about that. And then we have Professor Tim Moore, who I believe for over 3 decades taught high school in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, or the suburbs there. And then he made a career change for a variety of reasons and moved up to the university, where he works at the Center for the Study of the American Constitution. Is that the way to say it there,
Yes.
Professor Moore?
Yes, it is.
At the University of Wisconsin in Madison. He works for probably the foremost expert on ratification, John Kaminsky, who we all love. And we recommend, if there's any digital representation of John talking about the death of George Washington, you'll all want to see that there. And then to the bottom right, we have Chris Kavanaugh.
Mike and I are known as the 2 Bs, both Badgers.
Yeah, and they have Ron Dane's name tattooed on a certain body part, which we won't talk about. And then we have Chris Kavanaugh. He is a nationally recognized teacher. He's won multiple national teaching awards. He is a teacher currently in the great state of North Dakota, but for, I believe, at least 3 decades, if not more. He taught in the south of Indianapolis. I cannot remember the district, Mr. Kavanaugh. Can you help me out?
Plainfield High School.
Yeah, and I actually got to visit at high school. And in California, it would be called a university there, given all the fine facilities they have at Plainfield there. And he is a great representation that you can find love later in life. And that is what brought him to North Dakota. That and the cuisine, I believe, is what brought him to North Dakota. And so I am, of course, a recovered addict and a homeless man who they hired to host this program. I have no academic credentials whatsoever, other than a charming smile and a great head of hair. So that's me. And so today,
you guys are the 2 Bs Bulldogs.
Oh, that's right. Chris and I are the Bulldogs. They're the Badgers. And at one time in the next 10 years, as we'll be able to stand up on our 2 legs, we're going to actually have a ring battle between Badgers and Bulldogs, not the animals. All right. We're all animal rights people, but ourselves dressed up as Badgers and Bulldogs. And we'll put that on YouTube as well. So today's conversation is going to focus for you, We the People students and teachers, on Unit 1, Question 2. We're going to talk about the pillars of American constitutionalism. And we actually had over the week a discussion about pillars there. And so that was enlightening for a person with my limited academic background. But I will say, many times in the 40 years of learning and studying, teaching about America's constitutional system of government, I hear a lot from people that there's this singular influence on the American Constitution. And just as a side note, it generally is divine intervention, that God somehow reached down his hand and touched Americans and voila came the Constitution there. But in today's episode, we want to question that notion of a very limited or singular notion of influence on America's constitutional system of government. It may be true that some influences are more important than others or more significant than others, but there is no doubt that there is a myriad of influences, historical, philosophical, personal, which is something I want to get into a little bit, that led the framers to design the system of government that we have. The constituting of ourselves, and we've talked about this a number of times, is extremely important in the 21st century, in today's world, as we have local, state, and national discussions over who we are as a people and what is an American and what does America stand for. And so hopefully we'll be able to bring some clarity to that in today's discussion. I'd like to start out, and I know this will probably make at least the one Calvinist on the group a little bit uncomfortable, but it's kind of where I start out with students and this notion of influence. And I am curious, as long as we've known each other and been colleagues and friends, I don't know if I've ever asked this question or ever found clarity on somewhat on your intellectual development and your intellectual viewpoints here. So we all have a certain lens in which we view the Constitution, history, and American politics. What I'm curious about is, what were the influences for you guys? What do you identify as the influences that helped shape or define or construct the lens in which you view the Constitution, history, and American politics? So because I know he's more of a Phil Donahue guy like I am, I'm going to ask Mr. Kavanaugh first about his view. What kind of shaped?
Gee, thanks. And before we proceed, for any folks that are watching this, Dave Richmond, he's in my lower left. I know it's like a Hollywood Squares. Dave was a teacher of this program for multiple decades in California. And when he went on then to become the state coordinator of the program in California, it tells you how invested he is in this program. So even though he may be a homeless recovering addict right now, at one point he actually had a great knowledge of this. And so I don't want to not put that out there. So thanks for calling on me first. Let's see here. So my influences, I think my influences are twofold. And in terms of approaching the Constitution, that's what you're asking, my study of the Constitution?
The lens in which you see the Constitution, you see American history?
I see it as twofold. I see it, one, as a snapshot of what happened in 1787, as well as ratification debates in 1788. I see it, that snapshot in time, right? And it's like, I've seen people writing about this, and we hear this all the time. And I know we all kind of like, yeah, right. When you hear somebody say, well, the founders, this is what the founders said. Like, the founders spoke with one voice, right? The founders did not speak with one voice. There was a myriad of opinions about multiple issues. So it really is a tough thing. But my first lens is a historical lens. What was happening, what was happening that would cause these guys to say, you know what? These articles of confederation, they're not working, and we need to change it up. And how are we going to change this up? And then taking a look, obviously, at the convention and the debates, and then looking at the arguments that were, out in the air when the states were ratifying it. So I think I look at it from a historical lens, but then I also look at through the lens of change over time. And I don't know that the document has changed over time as much as we have changed over time. I always pose the question, how do we get from, Plessy versus Ferguson to Brown? Now, we had no new laws, no new amendments. We still had the 14th Amendment, which was ratified in 1870. So how have we changed per our Constitution, or how has our constitutional interpretation changed over time? And my third lens is, here we are, it's 2021. Do we need to revisit this? What would the framers think if they were to come back now to see an expansive federal government, right? When they thought they were designing a government with limited power. And would they think that we need to revamp some things and amend some things. I mean, as we're all aware, Jefferson said every 19 years we should rewrite the Constitution.
Well,
So
what I'm really curious about, Chris, is it sounds like you tend to take a very strong historical viewpoint. Well, what again, to help out a little bit, I look at the lens in which I see things, and to talk about the myriad. There's no doubt that excuse me, that my upbringing. I was raised by a fairly conservative father and a fairly liberal mother in Southern California in the 1960s and 70s, in which there were tumultuous times, and that debate, that contextual debate of my life, had some influence. College had probably, and I'll say maybe the most profound influence. My university experience, the professors I had. And one of the reasons I talk about this is it was either last week or the week before, Tim talked about biography with Hamilton being maybe a major factor that influenced the lens in which he saw things there. So much of mine is the context in which I was raised, and what was going on around me so much. A little bit, to a certain degree, were the intellectual influences of the things that I read and stuff, but those always seem to be filtered through my own personal experiences. And I'm wondering if you would say the same thing, or if the personal experiences had maybe less and the intellectual academic experiences had more.
Well, I think, yeah. I mean, I've never really thought of it in that sense to a degree, but I think that being of a certain age, that I remember growing up in Southern Indiana, being a young kid, and the Vietnam War was going on, and in Southern Indiana, small rural community, county seat, we were somewhat insulated and somewhat isolated, but I had some neighbors, and they were great musicians. They're just phenomenal musicians. One of them went on to be a session guy in Knoxville, Tennessee, guitar player, and they had a band, and everybody knew them. One of the guys would, an older guy, he was in high school, so I'm a little kid looking up to these guys, and he's getting out his guitar and he's just playing, sitting on the steps, and everybody's just kind of sitting around listening to it. And then I remember when they got busted for weed back in the day. And so it's like, wow, this is really weird, because now it's like I got these guys that kind of have some long hair, but I don't want to say they're cool guys, but they were good musicians, and now they did something that was like, so I think that maybe this conflict about rights, what rights we have and what powers the government has. And so being a child of that time, growing up with the Vietnam War as a backdrop, and a confusing time, I think that probably is one of the bigger influences on my perspective on things.
Yeah, and I'll say, and Mike knows this, probably the most profound in my early development, post high school, early university, college experience, was Theodore White. The Making of the American President was a book that I somehow, a professor recommended to me, and I fell in love with it. I fell in love with his narrative and things, and he became somewhat of a profound influence on me on the way to, of thinking about politics and thinking about history there. Professor Williams, I am, curious about you. You come of age at a different time than the rest of us. And again, I honestly don't know. I've known you for a very long time, but I am curious of what shaped the lens in which you view Constitution, politics, history.
Yeah, you really do have a skill, David, of asking really good questions. I'm being really serious. This is a really good question, so thank you for asking it. As I was listening to Chris and trying to think through, I think my father was a criminal defense attorney, and so I think my first thinking about the Constitution was really his stories about how he was using the Constitution and constitutional arguments to protect those who were accused of crimes. And that was from a very young age, right? And then it was my teachers. I mean, and it really was, not to get too weird, but you were my government teacher from 1986 to 87. We used the curriculum, the We the People curriculum, before it was an actual curriculum. They were testing it. And you kind of planted the seed that this constitutional history and the Constitution wasn't just about criminal trials. It was this living, breathing document that was exciting. And then it was really, and then for me, the event was 1989, 1990, from the Tiananmen Square massacre through the fall of the Cold War, and being a young person grappling with ideas and having those seeds been planted by my family and by teachers like you. And then to see these debates happen in real time about the construction of democracies in other parts of the world that would in some ways look like or not look like the United States. So I haven't thought about this, but when I look back on it, those were really those were the seeds. So it was about, by the time I was 22, I was probably kind of hooked on wanting to think about and read about and talk about the Constitution.
Tim?
Two major things. I started my professional career as a teacher in the very beginnings of the culture war. And at the time, and being immersed in the evangelical world for over 3 decades, it's interesting to see how that culture wars evolved. But in the early 80s, there were 2 influential people that really prodded me into thinking about and looking into this thing called the American Constitution, and neither one of them I agree with. Ed Meese was an important figure for me because he insisted that there was this thing as original intent. And a snake oil salesman by the name of David Barton, who makes the argument, back to your original opening statement, David, which I think is good, is there this singular causation explanation for why stuff happens? And David Barton is widely known in fundamentalist, even to some extent evangelical world too. And his singular explanation is the founding was rooted in Christianity. So in the early 80s, for me, these 2 individuals, Ed Meese's insistence on original intent and David Barton's insistence on Christian founding of America and the Christian founding fathers and all of that, really prodded me into thinking and seeing if these things were true. So that, I think, in the at a very fundamental basic level, I have Meese and David Barton to thank for a career pursuing what is this thing called the American Constitution system. And I think it's ironic. I essentially reject both of their premises, but I do have them. And I think in some ways, I think all of us, having suffered through good teachers and bad teachers, I think sometimes, it's important to have the folks that are kind of goofy, that push you along into thinking through some things. So I do see Meese and Barton as important. Now, the second wave, I think, is interesting because I stumbled across my boss, and he, one of the most important things that I've learned from him is to not think in categories. He's one of the few remaining progressive historians where it's all bottom up, what's going on with commoners, and has largely driven the way that we do the ratification series that we've done, these 35 volumes. And so he's rigorously anti-categorical. He's just like, what are the documents saying? And so that's why I occasionally get the digs in on the political scientists, because political scientists have created categories and silos and the way to place things. And it's very helpful actually to do that. But I think what I've learned in a secondary path, the secondary phase, is to be challenged on the notion of that history is very hard to make categories, to create categories and then to hold stiff and rigid in the face of historical evidence. So that would be my answer of influences.
And I know you guys understand why I asked the question, and I want students to comprehend and to understand themselves that Unit 1, to me, the key principle is influence. And to understand that we as individuals are not a byproduct of a singular event or a singular person. We are the sum total of a lot of different things. And so if we look, like the Supreme Court looks at corporations as people. If we look at the Constitution as a person, all right, it is a byproduct itself of a myriad of influences, and each and again, much more than an individual, I would say, and so it's important to kind of make that connection to who am I and why do I see the world this way, to understanding, I think, why the Constitution was structured and framed the way it was. Yet they were also, I think, prescient enough to try to create a way for each generation to have the ability, if they chose, to put their stamp on that Constitution itself. So the question talks about pillars, all right, and again relates to the idea of influence. And they seem to imply that the two major pillars, a lot of pillars, but the two major pillars are these philosophical categories, Tim, I don't know if they should be categories, of classical republicanism and natural rights philosophy. Just in a brief sense, again, I like to make sure we're kind of all in the same place and same time, and have a similar understanding of what these terms mean. Professor Moore, could you define for students what you understand classical republicanism to mean and natural rights philosophy to mean, all right, in this context of pillars?
Yeah, well, I think actually to give a shout out to the text itself and the writers of the text, they do a pretty good job of in basically saying, look, when you think about classical republicanism, it starts with the collective. There's a collective identity that precedes individual identity. And there's a commitment to small communities, homogeneity, small likeness within a community. There's which means there's a common belief system. There's moral education. And so starting with the premise of the collective and the community, I think has these secondary ripple effects, that there's a commitment to education, religious education. I mean, the Greek gods and goddesses, and the virtues of leaders. So I think if I, in trying to be 25 words or less on classical republicanism, that's how I would describe that. Now, I'll leave natural rights theory to Chris, because I do think he's more comfortable in the natural rights tradition than I am. So I'll leave it up to Chris.
Well, I would agree. I think going back to the idea of classical republicanism, just an oversimplification, very overly simplified for students listening, would be citizens are made, they are not born, right? You have all those things that Tim mentioned, all the things that your text mentions. Citizens is not like your parents get together 9 minutes later, plop, you appear, and then you're a citizen. There are certain things that you have to do to uphold that citizenship. In terms of natural rights, fast forward a few centuries to get us to the Enlightenment, and again, this is not a cop out. I think Tim's right. I think the text does a really nice job of this. However, for students doing this, I think that you will know that obviously there's a focus on Hobbes, there's a focus on Locke, there's a focus on maybe Rousseau a little bit, but there's so much more to the Enlightenment. Please make sure you're checking out the Scottish Enlightenment. That's really, really important to people like Harrington and Hume. There are other people that were very influential on the founders, and it goes back to Dave's original point. These influences on folks, right? I would recommend a book. I'm not going to hold it up because I don't want to get any grief. It's by Thomas Ricks. It's called First Principles. Excellent text on the influences on the framers and the founding fathers in terms of their education. So the idea of classical, of natural rights philosophy, you go from the good of the community to the good of the individual, and what's the best way to promote the good of the individual, right? That's an oversimplification, I know. So,
Mike, I'm wondering from a political scientist point of view, do you guys approach, I guess, in kind of your general introductory classes to government. Do these two pillars, are they something that is brought up at the university level, or is it assumed that all students know it, or that since they're again in this dying area called political theory, all right, which is not taught nearly as much as it was 30 years ago, and there's much more on governmental institutions. I'm just wondering, do you have a different perspective on these ideas than maybe the more historical view?
I don't think so. I mean, at University of San Diego, like political theory is very important to our major. So we have an undergraduate course that's required. We now have an upper division class that's required, and our preeminent political theorist actually showed up on one of these episodes with us, Tim McCarty. So yes, we sometimes, as Tim was saying, sometimes different political scientists will come up with a new name for something or a different way to call it, so they can make their name for themselves doing that. But yeah, at the basic, it's natural rights philosophy, classical republicanism. But I would say definitely the past 10 years or more or so, there's been other types of philosophies being discussed, right? So whether it's a class we offer on Black political thought, or thinking about, to get to Tim's point again about, from the bottom up, not just what intellectuals are saying and writing, but what are the variety of different philosophies that folks at this time period were kind of playing around with. So I would say that it's the way the People text does a good job of saying these are the two major pillars. I think there's more than two, obviously, and I think that students at the university level will definitely learn about those additional ones. And at some point tonight, I'm going to make an argument about a third pillar for sure, but I'm not going to do it right now.
Well, so these are, again, key pillars of the worldview, I would assume, that most of the framers had, most of the founders, framers in the 1770s, 1780s, that they possess. So let's actually look at some of the founding documents and the structure of the Constitution. And if you guys could talk about, one, not only how it influenced the way they thought about these, but also maybe what are some specific things students can go to and say, aha. And I know that maybe you might be a little reticent on this, but aha, I see this influence here, kind of stuff there. So Professor Moore, so where do you see these two pillars influencing both the founding documents and specifically institutions of government?
Well, in the founding documents, I guess you should, start with the Declaration. And I think often people look at the Declaration as really kind of an Enlightenment natural rights document, and it certainly has elements of that, tremendous elements. I mean, Jefferson basically does one of the greatest summary statements in our history, certainly, of Locke's Second Treatise. And I know there's an argument whether it was Hutcheson he was paraphrasing, and on and on and on and on. But sure, there's definitely a commitment to the natural rights theory in the second paragraph. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which he changed from property, estate. But also there's, in the list of grievances in the Declaration, there's a tremendous commitment to individual rights. The king has violated this right. The king has violated this right. But even in the list of grievances, too, there are statements that are more classical Republican. That the king's policies has upset the good balance of our communities. And in the last paragraph, and maybe at this point, Chris can chime in, there's this tremendous commitment towards, I believe, you can see classical republicanism in the last paragraph. Chris, maybe you could further that argument.
Well, I before I get to the last paragraph, I think there's that line before we get to the list of grievances where Jefferson says is not only is your right, it's your duty, right? When he uses the word duty, I think that is a classical Republican concept, that is, you're obligated to do this as a citizen, right? So that's, I think, a big thing. And I know there's one thing I geek out on too, is I think I've talked about this before, where they're able to look at Jefferson's original draft, and they use something called electoral spectral analysis, and realize that he had crossed out a word and put in a new word, and it was towards the end of the list of grievances. I think it was about impressment, and where he talked about taking our fellow citizens, right? And originally Jefferson had used the word subjects, and he crossed that out and he put in the word citizen. To me, that's a huge deal, because I'm not sure if that's a natural rights or maybe leaning more towards classical Republican idea that there is a degree of citizenship here, which is really, really important. In terms of the last paragraph, they're calling on divine providence to help them. We pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, our sacred honor. So the idea of sacrifice of individual for the betterment of the whole, I think, Tim, that is what you're getting at there in terms of the last paragraph. So I think you see that as well. And David, for one thing, for students, and I always have my students memorize this quote, which can be found right here. If you don't have this hip pocket guide, I get no kickbacks. You can download this for free. John Patrick's Understanding Democracy Hip Pocket Guide. A lot of good conceptual stuff in here for students from the Annenberg Foundation. But there's a quote on page 54, I believe, from Madison to Jefferson. He writes a letter in October 1788. He said, "It's a melancholy reflection that our liberty be exposed to danger, whether the government have too much or too little power, and that the line that divides it is so inaccurately defined by experience." And I talk about the line. It's the line. Right on one side of the line is what makes, and it's the last part of safety and happiness. Safety and happiness is the line. Safety, who keeps us safe? We give the government power, channeling our little inner Hobbesian, right? We're going to give the government power to keep us safe. What makes me happy is when the Cubs win championships and puppies and something good to eat, right? So me expressing my individual right. And we know that stuff happens. 9/11 happens. A pandemic happens. Forrest Gump said it. It happens. Not quite exactly that way, but it happens. And so that line is constantly in flux. And when we give the government too much power, the danger can become tyrannical. When we give the government too little power, then it's the walking dead. And there is no government, and we don't have to fear the walkers and the zombies that want to suck our brains. We have to fear the other people that will not respect my rights. So I think I use that concept of the line, and ask kids, when an event happens and the government takes an action or does not take an action, where does that fall in terms of natural rights and classical republicanism? I think that's a good teaching tool.
Professor Williams, any insights?
Yeah, I would point students to look at the preamble of the Constitution. To me, when I look at the preamble, there's a lot of classical republicanism in it, in terms of, starting off with "we the people," this notion of common defense, general welfare, and even the way the blessings of liberty is phrased, right? It's not the people's liberty or individuals' liberty, it's the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, which students know that means to future generations, right? So the preamble itself kind of lays out this, I think, very rich classical Republican idea that we are coming together to form a government and distribute power for all of us to kind of be in it together. So I'd have the students look at that.
Couple of quick, follow-ups here, because you guys talked about the Declaration of Professor Kavanaugh and more, but in the last paragraph, isn't the first paragraph of the Declaration kind of a classical, because it talks about one people, all right, breaking the bonds with another people, and in fact, it seems to have a statement of virtue that the respect and opinions to mankind requires, like we need to be honorable people. Could you make an argument that that's kind of a classical structure, statement?
I would, especially the identity principle of one people. I mean, that's very classical Republican. But the idea of separating and declaring the reasons that move us to this decision, that's very Enlightenment. So I think within that first paragraph, I think there's those two traditions. And it just dawned on me as Chris was talking about classical republicanism, I've often wondered, and I don't know, I'm just going to toss this out there. When Jefferson changes it from property to the pursuit of happiness, I've often wondered whether that's an Aristotelian term. Because, I mean, Aristotle, the difference between a good and bad systems is whether they produce happiness in the people.
Isn't that Cicero, though? Isn't it?
Well, I mean, Aristotle's framework was the happiness of the people was the rubric by which you could tell whether it was a good version or a bad version of the system. So pursuit of happiness, I wonder whether that's an Aristotelian move on Jefferson's part.
So my second quote, go ahead, Chris.
No, to your point about the first paragraph, I would agree with Tim. You absolutely could see some, catch a little odor of, if you will, of classical republicanism, but also I think that speaks to the politics of the time as well. Because, when you talk about dissolving the bands that connected them with another, well, what bands were being dissolved? It's just the political bands, right? Understand, students, it's just the political bands, because we still need to trade, and we may still need your Navy at some point, right? So anyway, there's that, as well as, with decent respect to the opinions of mankind, we may need some allies in this too. So there's some real world, realpolitik in that first paragraph too.
So my second question is it accurate to say, and again, this is one where I'm looking back on 35 years of doing this and identifying all the mistakes I made, but I used to make the argument to students, not tell them this as a fact, but it seems to me that the state constitution tend to have much more classical influences than the national constitution agreed upon in 1787. Would that be accurate or not?
Well, it depends on how you're defining republic. I mean, some of the ancient theorists said, a good republic is something you could walk across in one day. And anything that was bigger than that it couldn't be a republic. And that's why I think many of the anti-federalists wouldn't buy into this argument that we could be called a republic given the size of the country. So even the states themselves, maybe Rhode Island might qualify. Even the states themselves, even though they're more localized in the scope of their constitutions, I mean, I guess there's a generalized notion of smaller, more homogeneous groupings, because they did see themselves as separate identities. The folks in Georgia couldn't stand the folks in Massachusetts.
Right.
So,
can I jump in real quickly, Tim, and just add one? And doesn't the requirement of religious affiliation imply a classical Republican idea?
Yeah, and that's why all those early colonies and even the early state constitutions, there was still establishment. Right.
So, Chris, what about that?
The
state constitutions lean farther towards classical republican.
Well, I think to a degree, yes, but I also, they're lock-in the sense that you're going to get a listing of rights in many state constitutions that come first, right? So, and maybe not in the original 13, but as we, all study American history, right to left, as we begin to add states, you'll see that many states are very lock-in nature in terms of listing rights first before we get into the powers of government. So that, to me, that tells me that, that needle is bending more towards the natural rights philosophy, because we want to make sure we get this out first.
And they have plenary powers. The state constitutions are not limited in the same way the national government was argued to be, that these are enumerated, limited powers of the national government. State governments can do all kinds of plenary powers with very little restrictions, and so that can run afoul, I think, of somebody who's more libertarian or natural rights in their orientation. That a state constitution has much more power, plenary power, than a national constitution.
Tim, would you give a quick definition for plenary for kids, please?
Broad, open-ended.
Well, and again, just for students, trying to build those bridges of past to present, seems to be that's at the core, partly of our constitutional discussion today. Governors have plenary power, let's say with health and welfare, does the national government have plenary power with health and welfare when we look at vaccinations?
We'll see.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And and again, what this brings up, these two pillars, this whole two pillars being the maybe the key influences, not the only ones, but the key influences, seems to imply, and I think you guys brought this out a little bit, that metaphorically, and I don't know if it's actually literally, but pillars to me being a part of construction and architecture, imply a balance. All right, that in the whole of the structural building, you got these pillars, and there needs to be some balance there, or it's a home in Fairbanks, Alaska, that's tilting one way or the other here. So, Professor Williams, I am curious if the implication by these pillars is the idea of balance. What is your take, either historically or contemporarily, about the American Constitution? Has it, in your opinion, maintained a reasonable balance between these two pillars historically and then contemporarily? What's your insights or thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, when I think about the pillars, I think about the roof that maybe the pillars is holding up, needing that balance. But I'm also thinking about, what are the pillars sitting on? Like, what's that foundation, right? And I think we're out of balance. So I see, I don't know, one pillar is sinking a little bit more, right? I'm not an engineer, so I don't know how it does it, but it's sinking. But I think it represents the soil that these foundations were built on. So I don't think it's an even Steven. I don't think it's even in the 1780s and 90s. And I definitely don't think it's even now. I think we're much, much closer to you can see the founders in these documents, right? Really struggling with, how do we give people the autonomy to live life by the morals that they want, versus how do we build a society based on the morals that we think they should have to have a good democratic society? And that, to me, is the balance. And I think definitely since, I don't know, I'll leave it to the historians with this. I would say since the Industrial Revolution, definitely through the 20th century, there's much more, it seems to be, thinking about the individual component and much less about what are the duties and obligations I have as a citizen to my fellow citizens or to my government. What moral obligations does the government have to me, and what does that look like? We're much more living in a society which we're not quite maybe at Wall Street, the movie Wall Street, but that to me is like that demonstrates that kind of just debauchery of individualism, right? And I would say that we are at an imbalance now, and it's at an imbalance where I'm not sure whether that correction can be made or whether it's just built within the soil of our foundation itself.
Professor Moore Kavanaugh, responses, thoughts about Mr. Williams?
Well, I think we've had this discussion before last week when we talked about human nature. I mean, is it baked into the cake of human nature? And I would agree with Mike that, if we're going to argue that at the founding period, we had these two pillars, and yes, it would require balance. So I would think that Mike, being in Southern California, you would understand about things sinking anyway. But
you would think. You would
think, but I would definitely agree in terms of that we have become, out of kilter, definitely out of kilter. And I always think of a great question for students to wrestle with. How do we determine the common good for the nation? Right. It's one thing to try and determine the common good for your school, right, or your local school corporation, or your local area within the state where you live, or maybe even in the state where you reside, except for maybe some of the larger states like California that are incredibly diverse. North Dakota, we are not. Though we do have a fairly large Native American population. So how do you determine the common good for a nation as large and diverse as ours? And I think that's a tough question to wrestle with for kids. But I would agree with Mike that we are out of whack, and we've seen the idea of classical republicanism wane, as, it's all about my rights. It's all about my rights. But people forget there's a second R that goes with that. That's responsibilities, and it's a two-way street. So
I don't know what accent you were trying to do there. I don't know if that was
Louisiana. It was a little Forrest Gump.
Okay, that's what I was wondering there. What I'm curious about, and Chris, you asked a great. I mean, how do we do that? And that's part of the new science of politics that they're playing around with in writing the Constitution. But it seems to me that Federalist 10 probably tries to articulate it best. How do we do that? Well, we do that through representation that's been, divided and separated in so many ways that you don't have a singular faction taking over. And, and again, I don't have to explain to you Federalist 10 and how that's all, supposed to work. So I'm curious, is that where the breakdown is? Is that, it broke down because the system of representation and the procedures that Madison and Hamilton talk about in the Federalist Papers never really worked the way they argued rhetorically in the Federalist Papers?
Well, I think I would agree with part of that. Again, I don't want to go off on my usual diatribe here, but I think it's kind of part of that is baked into the Constitution itself. When you have a Senate that's established the way it is, so you've got supposedly 50 Republican and 50 Democratic senators, but the 50 Democratic senators represent over 41 million more people. So how will we really be able to tell what the people want, or how can we get legislation to reflect what the people want when they're not truly a representation of the people within the Senate?
And here's my struggle with that, Chris. And I mean, I fully understand where you're coming from, but you're viewing that from a presentism kind of lens.
Well, no, James Madison. We've departed from justice to conciliate the smaller states. That's a great quote within the We the People text, right? Think about that. We've departed from justice to conciliate the smaller states. So that's Madison, right?
And I understand his disappointment and melancholy about the whole Senate thing. But the idea behind it, at least what they argue in the Philly, is you seem to be looking at the Senate as a group of collective groups rather than individual senators representing states, right? And individual states. If it plays out that way, that they are representing their individual states and not region and collectives, isn't there a greater chance for this balance and this idea of the common good to play out? Is that a bad? Yeah, you're okay. You're giving me a no.
No, I don't think so, because when the majority of people, and most polling will show you what the majority of people favor, yet we can't get that done. Why is that? Because if the majority of people favor, say, I don't know, decriminalization of marijuana, legalization of marijuana, 70% of the population favor that. Why can't we get that done nationally?
Well, because the republics, because most of the people in those small places don't want that. But I can't help but think that from the get-go, we and the anti-federalists make this argument. They say, "Look, don't tell me that this is a republic." I mean, it seems so much of our frustrations with the Senate or representation in general, no matter whether it's the House, the Senate, or in our state legislatures, so much of it is erroneously assuming that we have a republic. The states are not republics in the classical Republican sense. They are way too big, and they were at the founding. You look at the internal politics of those states, and there were tremendous differences from region to region to region. So I think this, I guess I'm dabbling on the edge of challenging the premise of these philosophical categories of being that important, because I actually think that an ounce of history is a pretty decent corrective to categorical thinking. Sorry, no. To philosophically.
Was that a shot across Mike's mouth?
No. I modified it. I mean, an ounce of studying British history, I think, is a corrective to putting all your eggs in even these two pillars that we've been talking about.
Go ahead, Mike.
Sorry.
Well,
Mike, go ahead.
I mean, I want to make sure the students realize that classical republicanism isn't just about the common good. I mean, that's one element of it. I mean,
Right.
but to me, it's the idea of like, what are the responsibilities, duties, and obligations do we have to each other? Does the government have for us, for the good of all of us, right? And I was just thinking about what I said just now about the Industrial Revolution. You know, Putnam would argue it really happens after World War II. And this gets to Chris's point where, for whatever reasons that we can go into in another episode of this, about why the government isn't as good as like solving those problems that we as a society want solved, but that has a feedback mechanism, right? And when people don't think government can solve their problems, or when people don't think that their local groups can solve their problems, they're less inclined to want to participate in those groups and to feel like they have an obligation, and they become more and more atomized, right? And more just thinking about themselves and their pocketbooks. So I do think there's a feedback here in terms of how government works that's important here. And to me, it's more than just what's the common good. We're getting into the nitty gritty of why is it that we could build a highway system in the 1950s, right? And we probably can't do the same kind of thing now as a society. Like, what's missing now? And the classical Republicans would say, what we're missing is some trust we have with each other and a trust we have with government.
So I'm going to start with you, Professor Williams, on this, and that is, there obviously are more than two pillars. And that's how we started off. And I think in many ways, I want to emphasize to students, again, this notion of a myriad of influences, and having more, and the more, tools or influences you have in your toolbox, I think the better off you are on having a conversation about this. And so, Professor Williams, beyond the two might be big pillars at the front door, what do you see as other pillars of influence on American political and constitutional thinking in the 18th century?
Yeah, and here I want to introduce the students to kind of two scholars that have really influenced my thinking on this. One is Roger Smith, who is a political science professor at University of Pennsylvania. And he's written a book called Civic Ideals. He also has an article called Beyond Tocqueville. And he wrote this article 20 years ago, where he argues there are three strands of American political philosophies, right? Natural rights theory, classical republicanism, and then what he calls ascriptiveness, but what I think the students would understand as nativism. Just this basic idea that some people are inferior than other people. And he sees that as not a blip on our way of becoming a great place. He sees it as part of who we are. So he got me thinking about this, and then I am going to hold up a book here because Kavanaugh taught me. I can't do it with my thing. Okay. Dang technology.
Okay, that's your technology. I thought maybe I was still hungover. So anyway, go ahead.
It's let me see if I can do it. Hang on. Here we go. Yeah, it's called Stamped from the Beginning by our favorite scholar, Ibram Kendi. And the argument here is just bear with me for just a couple minutes here. He argues that this idea of nativism, this idea of making an argument that people are less than you, right, has to do not with an idea, it has to do with a policy. And he argues as early as, well, in the 1450s, the King of Portugal has someone, he goes out and he says, hey, write a book about why slavery is such a good thing. And we have the first European book written in 1753 by Zurara, explaining that slavery was okay based on Christian principles because Black Africans were inferior to Europeans. That's 300 years before Thomas Jefferson was born in 1743. So I just want students thinking about, as we think about this idea of what the founders, what are their influences, both consciously and unconsciously. Even the term enlightenment itself, this idea of coming through 1,000 years of darkness, and now there is lightness. There's a quote by Benjamin Franklin who says, lightness, yes, my complexion, who we are as a people, are better than the dark people. Like it's not just a political philosophy, it's much deeper than that. And it has the roots of nativism, of this instance, racism. And so our founders, I believe that when our students see this in documents, when they see the fact that the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson had a beautiful couple paragraphs, right, Chris, where he was blaming the English basically for slavery, that's taken out. When we have the 3/5 compromise, I want the students to really think about, not that Thomas Jefferson, it's not as easy to say, oh, he was just a racist. No, I'm not saying that. But this idea of nativist thinking was just part of the society. And you had someone, I'll finish here, you had a lot of Enlightenment thinkers who were simultaneously abolitionists and what Kendi would call racist, meaning they believed that slavery should be gone, but they never believed that blacks and whites could be equal, right? And they had different ways of dealing with that, whether that was colonization or whether that was other things, right? So that to me is an important pillar that I think students should be thinking about in terms of our Constitution. And because when we move on from 1787, 1789, we know the history of the constitutional development is dealing with what some call the original sin of slavery and the original sin of racism. It didn't just show up there for no reason. It showed up because it was in the air that the founders were breathing at the time.
Yeah. Mike, so quick question.
Yeah.
So how would you categorize that pillar then, simply put, for the students?
Well, I would say, I would probably use
Exceptionalism.
no.
Well, it's exceptionalism on steroids, certainly.
All right.
Well, but I think your point is well made, because if you look at, and for students that have been through, history classes, whether it be an A-push class or not, you're looking at the Portuguese, you're looking at the Spanish, and they have instituted these caste systems and the plantation systems, and those pecking orders were in place, long before, as Mike alluded to, long before the era of Jefferson at all. So it is kind of part of who we are, right? But we know that we can find exceptions to that as well, as we will begin to see those exceptions and people pointing out the hypocrisy of talking about some of these things at the founding era about liberty and freedom, yet we're going to maintain the institution of slavery. So there is some light being shed on it, just not nearly enough.
Yeah.
Professor Moore, we'll have to grapple with Mike's pillar that he's added, but what other pillar or pillars?
Well, I can assure you that my pillar you can easily ignore. I think I have to follow up that eloquent. All right, I'll just start. I do think the founders were heavily influenced by British history, and those who have been around a little bit and have thought about their experience, they were not comfortable with centralized power. That's a very British thing. The British fought about that in the 1600s domestically, Parliament and the Crown, and it kind of opens up that 100 plus year of benign neglect for Americans to develop a real sense of resentment towards centralized power within their colonies, but also when Britain occasionally tries to tighten the screws in the colonies. I mean, most notably the Dominion of New England. So I think a pillar that the We the People text, as good as it is, I think, on classical republicanism and natural rights theory, I would really stress to students to look into some of the hot button issues for British colonials who would eventually become Americans, that they truly were wrestling with power being centralized or decentralized. That's a key, I think, feature when you study British history. And because they're British, they inherit that sensitivity about centralized power or decentralized power. I mean, it certainly drove their desire for the Articles of Confederation, which is very decentralized in how it distributes power amongst the states. And then the centralization, the Anti-Federalist claim is just, that's not who we are, to centralize power. We fought a revolution against this centralization principle. So I'd say British history is a major pillar as well for students to consider.
Professor Gavin.
Well, I think this is, I'm probably going to use a word that Tim was just describing. I'm going to say federalism. I think that, I mean, that's what Tim was just describing, but this
British federalism. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so the sliding scale of sovereignty, to also steal one of Tim's words, is sovereignty, that, who's sovereign? We're going to start with the king, right? Then we're going to have this big urinating contest between the king and parliament. And as Tim just alluded to, so then there's a shared sovereignty. Then eventually parliament is sovereign. We have these colonies that are developing on their own. They are writing their own stuff. They're doing their own thing because of this period of, salutary neglect. And all of a sudden, mom comes back in and says, "Oh, by the way, we're going to limit your curfew. You can't have the car." And it was, well, wait a minute, I had all this liberty, and now you're taking some of this stuff away from me. And so, it gets into this contest that leads to the American Revolution. But, this debate over who has the power, who is sovereign. Is this going to be a strong national government? Should it be state government? Should it be local? And I think that, and you guys have heard me say this before, you look at the last paragraph of the Declaration of Independence: free and independent states, free and independent of Great Britain, but free and independent of each other, which leads, of course, to the, Articles of Confederation. And now you're getting rid of the Articles, and now you're talking about creating this stronger national or central government, which the Anti-Federalists rail against. So I think that that concept of federalism and who has the power to do what, I think, is a absolute pillar upon which our nation was founded. And we still struggle over. I mean, obviously, we still struggle over it all the time today.
And obviously, and we opened up, trying to talk kind of a little personally about how we all developed our lens. Obviously, to me, pillars are their own experiences. The colonial experience, the state constitution writing is an experience. And they're doing that within a confederation period, under a constitutional arrangement that we can debate of whether it was how effective it was. So there are those pillars. The one I want to emphasize that I don't know if it gets emphasized enough, and maybe I overemphasize it, and that is not only the Enlightenment, but the scientific revolution. And this, the notion of, I guess, in some ways, of natural law, that looking at human society within the context of the scientific method and scientific principles, and you can see that, I think, in a number of places within the Constitution, or at least in the writings about that, whether it's Federalist 51 and ambition shall counteract ambition, it's a fundamental law of physics. About for every force, there must be a counterforce. And there's mathematics. I mean, what's Madison playing around with there in Federalist 10? It's probability. You multiply the factions out on a national level, you diminish the probability that one singular faction is going to be taking over. So beyond just, I think British political constitutional history is, again, I think it's a major pillar. So much of American political thought is born after the Glorious Revolution, the English Bill of Rights, that struggle between monarchy and parliament, centralization, decentralization, and we see it, of course, cross the Atlantic in the 17th and 18th century. I agree with Tim there, but there's also other events within on the continent of Europe, within France and the Netherlands and various other places that are having influence on the thinking and ideas about government. The one thing I do want to ask Tim, and
can I ask Mike a question? If Mike is right, that in our history that there was this nativism, I wonder if that's a pillar in every nation's experience in how they constitute themselves? Do they all carry this self-absorption, we're better than everybody else, into their constitutional projects? I'm trying to get Americans off the hook, I guess is what I'm trying to do.
Yeah,
here.
no, I do. And I think that's the, for me, when I really think about this, it kind of blows American exceptionalism out of the water, right? Because to some extent, our experience as coming together as a society, it looks like a lot of other places. Now, obviously, race is the major sort of identity factor here. But let me just back up. To get to David's point, like the scientific revolution, Enlightenment, part of that was like the categorizing and understanding nature, right? And part of that is like the Swedish botanist Linnaeus, where he said, well, there are certain classes of people, right? And within Homo sapiens, Europeans are at the top and Africans are at the bottom. That's part of the Enlightenment as well. And what the Americans, I think, do with that, because race is so important, is they can use that thinking and put Africans on the bottom. Well, what are Europeans doing with that? Who's at the bottom there? The Jewish people or Polish people. So yeah, I do think it's endemic, maybe as part of the human condition, to justify your acts if those acts are hurting others and you want to justify it. But I also think it has to be salient with what the soil is with where you're at. And if there aren't Black slaves in your society, but there are others that you can oppress to make your life better, then that becomes the group. And to that extent, I think we could go through human history all across the world and find groups that have been oppressed that makes the American experience much more common.
No one wants to be the last rung on the ladder.
What's that?
Nobody wants to be the last rung on the ladder.
No,
right? In every society, no one wants to be the bottom.
Yeah.
We all know what rolls downhill.
Yeah.
And that lands on that group that's in the bottom in any society.
Yeah.
We'll save that for later. Sorry, I'm visualizing rolling downhill. So I do have one last question, and I'm going to ask Mr. Moore, because the text kind of touches on it but doesn't. And that is, and I started off talking about where I live and what I hear a lot in the community that I live in is that the Constitution and the American political culture is divinely inspired. All right. Again, God reached down, touched, and we're the new chosen people there. So, and I don't want to equate the two, but there is this notion of Judeo-Christian thought having an influence on American political thought. To what degree do you agree with that? And if so, can you kind of, elaborate a little bit on where that is?
Well, I think I do believe that there was some the influence of biblical thinking. I think largely, though, I would caveat it by saying, really, the notion of covenant really was prominent in some of the founders' thinking. In other words, we're going to create a covenant. We're going to call it the Articles of Confederation, or we're going to create a covenant. Lincoln saw the Constitution as a covenant in his first inaugural address. We cannot separate, we cannot divorce, because he says covenants are so important that you can't leave. So I think the notion of community, classical republicanism, I think fits very well in some of the way that some of the founders thought about creating communities and how binding they were and what identity those communities were based upon. I think they thought pretty heady that the Constitution would be able to create an identity. So I think in that sense, there's some covenantal ideas in some of the founding principles. Now, whether they wanted a Christian America where everybody worshiped Yahweh and all that kind of stuff, I think that argument to me breaks down pretty quickly. But I do think that there was an overarching philosophical commitment to this this very bindingness of covenantal ideas that was, I would say, was there, and Lincoln tapped into, I think, in his rhetoric about the nature of the tragedy of the Civil War.
You see that for the students too. You can find that some of that same thought process in the articles. In the Northwest Ordinance.
Yes.
You look at some of the and fast forward, you can see some of the same language that Tim was just alluding to in Dr. King's "I Have a Dream" speech. If you actually listen to some of the things that he's putting forth, there is that idea of covenants within his speech, and you see that in the Northwest Ordinance of 1787.
Well, that's a good place to wrap up our session today, students and teachers. Professor Moore had mentioned this notion of benign neglect, which leads us to our next session that we'll talk about in a week or so, looking at the American Revolution and what possibly brought that about. I also want to talk about whether it's justified. It's one of my favorite topics to talk about. And so we look forward to seeing you again. We hope that you enjoy this conversation that we had today, and we hope that you have a good week. Until then, peace, love, yogurt tacos. Bye, 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 bonds. Peace, love, yogurt tacos.